You're still muted, but
I just got a call from my grad assistant reminding me to record. So
okay.
I just did that because he knows me that I'd forget. So I'm doing well. I guess are we the only people here? Oh, we're here with a couple of people in the waiting room. Oh gosh, admit all. Okay, people are being admitted. Hi everybody. Hi Howard. Hi Carolyn. Um, oh, Carolyn. Yeah, no. So I'm doing well. Thank you again so much for doing this,
Oh,
Eric.
I'm excited.
And I
It'll be
love
fun.
kind of bring in Chat GPT. I just heard a great interview with a Wharton professor who's like, yes, I'm requiring my students to use it. It's not a matter of blocking it. It has to be
No.
part of all education. So we'll have a
See, I hope that like I want you to talk during that time too, because it's like at the end, it's like 2 slides. It's so funny. I mean, I was like in this rabbit hole about it, and then I like had to pull myself out of it because I started to get real freaked out. So I think we can just chat about, I feel like a little out of touch sometimes with everything that's happening. So I'm curious to see like
yeah,
what else like.
sure. I think it's a great topic to bring up. So let's
Mhm.
we'll wait for people to join. I'll probably start about 12:02. So
Okay.
great. Hi everybody. We'll start in about 3 or 4 minutes. Well, John, you know me. I see you're on. I hear you're. I'm constitutionally against ever starting anything on time. But give us one more minute for people to join, then we'll start up. It's good that you're here, John. You're on time. See, you're an on time kind of person, and you're on mute.
You know the expression, if you're on time you're late, you're late. Ours is if you're on time you're early.
That's it. Yeah. I used to kid Eric Meslin. He always started meetings on time. I always said, you should have been more part of the Bush White House, not the Clinton White House. Clinton White House ran famously behind.
Yes.
So okay. Well, it's 12:01. I'll go ahead and get started. So it's my I'll take the liberty of introducing our speaker, Dr. Cheng, who has given a version of this talk in some of our courses. I think I've never seen it though, because I think it's the course that actually Colin Halverson runs. And I've heard only amazing things about it. And she's tweaked it for this setting to be more, I think, more about research ethics and less about clinical. But again, I expect this to be an outstanding talk, no pressure. Cheng is assistant professor of medicine, pediatrics. I have been honored, and I've learned every time I've come to your mentorship meeting. It's often the mentee is the mentor. I learn from Erika all the time. And it's my pleasure to have her here. This is the next version of our TREATS series, Translational Research Ethics, Applied Topics. That's a series that the BSAP program, the Bioethics program of the Indiana CTSI, has run for a bunch of years. These talks are recorded, put online with some supporting documents. Erika will send me some supporting documents, I assume, after, and we'll post it all for researchers. The idea is to give an introduction to some of the key topics to think about as you do research in one of these areas, in this case, artificial intelligence. So it is my pleasure to hand this over to Dr. Cheng and to sit back up and get out of the way. I look forward to participating in the discussion afterwards. Dr. Cheng.
Thank you, Dr. Schwartz. That was so nice of you. It's like the warmest introduction I've ever received. I'm really happy to be here and to give this chat. I'm going to share my screen and start my slideshow. Can you all see what you're supposed to see? Are you seeing my notes? Nope, that's right? Okay. So I'm just going to start. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Peds, as Peter said. I use a little bit of machine learning in my research, and so it just sort of opened up the door to this whole world of artificial intelligence. I'm by no means an expert in the topic, but I'm going to share with you what I do know, as hopefully we can talk about it and what the ethical implications are of research using these methods and then applying these methods in your clinical practice. So I'll start by, just sort of defining what machine learning is and why it matters. And I will say that both AI and machine learning, they nest under this field of data science, where the purpose is to extract insights from data. Both data science and machine learning, they analyze the really large amounts of data to deliver value to some end user. So AI describes a machine that's capable of imitating and performing intelligent human behavior. So things like translation abilities. And then machine learning is the largest and most common application of AI. And that describes machines that are taught to learn, that are taught to learn and to make decisions by examining the data. So these machines, they make suggestions, they make predictions based on analyzing all these data, and they perform tasks that we think like require human intelligence. When companies today are deploying artificial intelligence, they're most likely using machine learning, so much so that the two terms are often used interchangeably. But the key difference here is that machine learning and artificial is really like learning from the data and in ways that we never thought was possible. In fact, I'm going to date myself here, but I always show this, and like some people chuckle and some people look at me like they have no idea what I'm talking about. But there was this movie that came out 20 years ago, starring Tom Cruise. I know he looks the same right now, but this was from 20 years ago, called Minority Report. And the premise behind it was that Tom Cruise, it was set in the future, in some dystopian future, and Tom Cruise was a police officer in charge of this like very special unit that was able to see the future, to see who was predicting crime before the crime was committed, and then he would go out and arrest those people to kind of eliminate crime from society by identifying prior to the crime who was about to commit it. And the thought that like a computer or could learn without being explicitly programmed to learn is like this completely crazy notion, right? Like at the time, this was marketed as a sci-fi movie. And it hit mainstream. But the reality is that now like these kinds of things are happening every day, and it's no longer science fiction. There was a recent survey from Deloitte that found over 2/3 of companies use machine learning to make all sorts of business decisions. So I think that, today the reality is that basically every industry has access to these huge amounts of data, and they use the data to gain advantage over their competitors using machine learning. So this includes applications to social media, the justice system, government, healthcare decision-making, including diagnosing things, triage. Financial institutions use it for online fraud detection. Retail companies use it for things like personalized marketing. And it's not just aspects of these industries that are using the technology. It is the entire industry. So Facebook is a really great example of how ubiquitous machine learning has become, because really nearly everything that you engage with on the platform uses machine learning in some way. And I'm going to talk about Facebook a lot today, I'm sorry, but it's a really good example of just how machine learning is all around us all the time. So Facebook has a facial recognition system that it uses to suggest tags and to help your friends recognize each other in photographs. It has textual analysis that takes the words in your posts and use it to guide its advertising, its news feed, its friend recommendations. It uses machine learning to analyze your age, your gender, your location, your page likes, your interests, the mobile data and your mobile data to profile you into different categories, and then it uses that to show you ads that are specifically targeted towards those categories. They have an in-house translator program to make sure that users all over the world can use the platform. And then of course it has this news feed, which delivers, prioritizes, and even hides stories based on who you interact with. There's a chat. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Oh.
It's just me, Erica. People were in the waiting room and I did not see them. Now they're all in, and I was sending them a chat to let them know that you just started. Again, I apologize.
Okay, I'm just talking about Facebook. I'm sure everybody knows this already, but it's just sort of a primer of how big data is all over the place. So in a bit, I'm going to talk about the ethical implications of this in various settings. But first, I really want to I want to take a step back and explain why these tools were developed in the first place and what really all the fuss was about. So why was there just all this optimism about machine learning to make high stakes decisions? And here's one example that I think illustrates it really well. It's from employment, where there was some really seminal work dating back almost 20 years. Some of you are maybe familiar with these studies. Where the authors sent resumes to employers that were basically identical, with the only thing that the authors varied were signals of the applicant's race. So in the case of the paper posted here, the authors altered the names of the people applying such that the names were, white sounding versus more distinctively Black names. And everything else on the resumes was identical. And this seminal study aimed to determine how the callback rates differed based on the perceived race of the applicants, meaning were the employers more likely to reach out to the applicant given their race. And what they found was pretty damning, right? So the callback rate for applicants with white sounding names was 50% higher for those with Black sounding names, with everything else being the same. And you might think, well, this study was conducted 20 years ago. There's been a huge investment on social awareness about implicit bias that's taken place since then. And so surely there's been progress and this wouldn't happen now. But unfortunately, a somewhat recent meta-analysis that was done in 2017 found that there hasn't really been a big change in this rate. And I think we can all agree that that's quite discouraging. And so one way to think about how to deal with this is to try to formalize the decision-making process even more by limiting the degree to which humans are involved in the process. So there's this thought that machine learning is going to be this kind of pinnacle for formal decision making, right? It's not going to be us sitting down and writing out a heuristic about what we think a good employee might do. We're going to actually learn what a good employee is from data. The data are actually going to come right directly from to us, and through machine learning, we're going to make sure that our decisions are not discriminatory. We're going to automate these decisions, and we can eliminate the role for any sort of subjective assessment that often happens when decisions are made by humans. And this was just this real compelling vision, and it led to articles like this one in 2015, published in the New York Times, where the author said, hiring could become faster and less expensive, and their data could lead recruiters to more highly skilled people who are better matches for their companies. Another potential result is a more diverse workplace. The software relies on data to surface candidates from a wide variety of places and match their skills to the job requirements, free of human biases. Lovely thought. And then a few weeks later, the same author published a different story that kind of spelled out what some of the risks are, in fact, when we do use data to drive decisions. It doesn't really mean that those decisions are suddenly neutral or objective or fair. They're actually quite vulnerable to a lot of the biases that we thought that they might stamp out. So this is what we're discovering now, right? So the quote in the same author a couple weeks later said, but software is not free of human intelligence. Algorithms are written and maintained by people, and machine learning algorithms adjust what they do based on people's behavior. And as a result, algorithms can reinforce human prejudices. And so the purpose of my showing these two articles that, again, were released within a couple weeks span is that they illustrate the shift in discussion that we've seen over the past 5-10 years or so, where there was once all this enthusiasm and hope that machine learning and AI algorithms were broadly being this force to advance civil rights and protect people against discrimination. But increasingly we see that there's a realization that this really isn't an automatic feature of using this technology. That there's many ways that AI can lead to similar problems that human decision making that it was intended to replace. And so, I think there's a reason to believe that this is all still really a possibility. But I think, despite this promise, there's risks, there's ethical issues that I want us to talk about today and to be aware of as you encounter these these tools. And when I first put this talk together, it was all about the drawbacks of AI, but, as sort of a warning against implementing these algorithms of doing research using these tools. But the reality is that AI is here to stay, and its use, especially in healthcare and in research, is only going to become more widespread. So I really want people to think about how we can use AI responsibly. And I hope that the information that we talk about today can help you guide your research when you're using AI in your own research and in your clinical practice, that when your clinical practice is augmented by AI, that it can kind of guide your clinical decision-making too. So how does this all play out in healthcare? Well, it might come to no surprise to you, but AI is everywhere in healthcare. The huge variety of big data that we have access to opens the door to these, previously unimaginable applications of data mining for disease prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. The thought is that AI in healthcare can close gaps in access, predict clinical outcomes, guide healthcare assessments, inform the delivery of individual tailored interventions, classify individuals by health relevant characteristics, this precision medicine initiative. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the applications of AI in healthcare that we see. So one way that AI is being used is when prioritizing who should receive care. So this was particularly relevant recently during the COVID pandemic, when acute care resources were really stretched, and there was a demand for ways to identify patients who might be most in need of immediate care and who might benefit most from it. During that time, Epic developed an index that was implemented in healthcare systems across the United States with the goal. It was called a deterioration index, and the goal was to help physicians decide when to move a patient in or out of intensive care. So the thought was that there's limited number of intensive care space. If you can predict who's going to benefit the most from a bed, then you can move them out, and vice versa. So, all across the country, this score was displayed on the chart of every patient that was admitted to the hospital. And you could kind of see it in the lower right-hand corner there. Hospital systems used it to decide who should receive intensive care. At the time that it was implemented, it hadn't been independently evaluated. Epic built the algorithm without there being a lot of study about it. But since then, studies have shown that there's this one study on the left of almost 400 COVID patients admitted to a Michigan medicine, saw that the index was moderately successful at discriminating between low-risk patients and those who were high risk of being transferred to an ICU, getting placed on a ventilator, or dying when admitted to the hospital. AI is also being used to share the expertise and performance of specialists and to supplement providers who might otherwise lack that expertise or who might not be available. So these algorithms are really common for use. They can read X-ray images to give diagnoses that would otherwise require like an ophthalmologist or an oncologist or a radiologist. So using these programs, a general practitioner, a technician, or even the patient themselves can reach the same conclusion that would normally require specialized medicine. So you can see that this might have really important implications for providing care in underserved areas and rural areas. It's really good for early detection, for tumor monitoring, et cetera. So in that way, it sort of increases access to care. AI is really flashy in its use of prediction. So in this case, it's doing things that human providers, even really good providers, can't do. So this is an example from Google Health, where they've developed a program that can predict the onset of acute kidney injury up to a couple days, 2 days before the injury occurs. And so normally in current medical practice, the injury often isn't noticed until after. The thoughts are that these algorithms performance. And I think, we can all agree that's a really exciting concept. And then there's this concept of personalized medicine. So if you think about how AI is being used to deliver care to cancer patients. So cancer diagnoses can be really complicated, both for physicians who make the decisions and for patients who have to understand sort of the risks and success of different kinds of treatments. And so now people are developing AI models that can help streamline this process by taking information from all different kinds of sources, from blood tests, X-ray images, genetic information from tissue biopsies, and training a model that can rapidly consolidate provide an accurate prediction of the patient's diagnosis, about different treatment options that were most likely to succeed, about the prognosis. And this, in turn can empower physicians to give their patients a treatment that they know is going to work for them, and empowers patients to receive information and, creates more of a thinking kind of model. And so these are sort of the types of models that are being deployed to predict health outcomes and ultimately improve the delivery of health care. And, sounds great, right? No problems. I'm done talking. I think that the whole idea of this is really lovely. AI and big data have created these great opportunities for clinical practice, for healthcare delivery, for your research. But I think that there are also some really important questions and ethical challenges that warrant discussion. So much so that some have suggested that to navigate the increasing complexity of life online, we have to completely rethink our conceptual frameworks, including our ethical and legal ones. And which ethical and legal issues am I talking about? So I'm going to talk about the following in terms of research and application of the AI. So I'm talking about informed consent, data transparency and fairness, privacy, and safety and accountability. So when I'm talking about informed consent, as you know, informed consent enacts respect for research participants and promotes their fundamental ethical interests by disclosing information about a study's purpose, risks, procedures, including procedures for handling personal samples and data, as well as measures to cope with harms resulting from participation. So, my question to you is this even possible in an online environment when you're collecting your data in these big data situations? So I'm going to use this iconic Facebook study as an example. Sorry, again, to bring up Facebook. For those of you who, I'll just briefly go over these facts for those of you who might not remember. For 1 week in 2012, Facebook altered the algorithms it used to determine which status updates occurred in the newsfeed of nearly 700,000 randomly selected users, which is about 1 in every 2,500 users at the time. The users had information that appeared on their news feeds altered by Facebook, such that it was either mostly positive stories versus mostly negative stories. The researchers wanted to investigate whether emotional contagion was possible via social networks. So in other words, can a person's mood be manipulated by the content that they saw on their Facebook feed? Importantly, the experiment was conducted without prior consent from these randomly selected users. And the study took place for a week, and then there was a study that was quickly published afterwards in a very high impact journal, and got a lot of attention. So my question for you, and I was going to put a little poll in here, but I actually don't know how. I know Peter does it all the time, but I don't know how. But the question that I have for you is, was this ethical? What do people think that this was an okay thing? Oh, I don't want to spoil the surprise. Do people think that this is an okay thing to do? And normally I'd have you all raise your hands and tell me, but just think about it for a second. Like, what are the ethical issues behind a study like this? So the study had a lot of press, and there was a lot of positive press. And at first, there was an article that said, one forced to conduct painstaking personal interviews with subjects, scientists can now sit at a screen and instantly play with the digital experiences of millions of internet users. This is the future of human subjects research. But then, I think as people started to really think about this, there became some negative press along with it, especially because the authors themselves, one was employed at Facebook, but the other were research professors from universities, and so employed by universities with IRBs and research training. And so there was a lot of, why this study wasn't subject to wasn't human subjects research in the sense that it should have gone through an IRB. What are the issues with informed consent? And that led to the same journal editorial board publishing an expression of concern and correction, where they said, questions have been raised about the principles of informed consent and the opportunity to opt out in connection with research in this paper. So, despite publishing the paper a month later, the editors expressed concern about this informed consent issue. And, going back to whether or not this is ethical, the question becomes, had Facebook been given permission by an independent IRB to perform the research? And the answer is no, because Facebook is a private company. They're not governed by the common rule. They're not required to get an IRB. And then what about informed consent, you might ask? Well, their terms of agreement, which is on this part on the right, this little part where you click on their terms and use, which is the circle part. If you click on that and you read it, there's a line in there that says that Facebook may use the information we receive about you for internal operations, including troubleshooting, data analysis, testing, research, and service improvement. So does that, do you think that applies to existing user data? In other words, allowing Facebook to observe your data? Or does that mean that Facebook can manipulate the data that the users see? Are either of those things okay? Are both of those things okay? And I think this brings up another important issue with big data analysis, is that this thought of like repurposed data. So in this example, Facebook, again, they altered the home pages of millions of users to include this I voted box with a get out and vote message. And then they put pictures of friends who said they had already voted. So nobody, opted into this. Like, this is just something that they wanted to see what happened if they manipulated these screens, if they could increase voter turnout. And then they did this to 60+ million people. And they found that it did generate an additional 500,000 votes, according to their methods of analysis. And again, they said that this was sort of under the same data use agreement that everybody clicks on in order to use the platform that gave Facebook permission to do this kind of feed of page manipulation and newsfeed manipulation. So I think, when you, sorry, I don't know why my mouse is so fussy. So one of the big features of big data analysis is like when you are using existing data sets to yield new information, a human would find it nearly impossible to search through tens of thousands of medical records to discover these new patterns and novel insights. But an AI algorithm can do that, in a moment. And so this might be really beneficial in some contexts, but informed consent, like, do you think that informed consent needs to be obtained if the original consent is no longer applicable? So for somebody who consents, somebody who consented to use their postal code may wish to withdraw consent if they learn that the data are then going to be used to just, to determine somebody else's insurance premiums. But a person might initially consent to having Facebook, their likes publicly viewable on the page, but they might not consent to having a third party, use that to manipulate voter turnout. Or to figure out, to predict her sexual orientation, or to use those predictions to target ads towards them. For most users, that kind of data sharing likely goes beyond what you think you're doing when you're consenting to using the platform. So when I turn on the location services on my phone, I just want to check the weather. I don't think that I'm consenting towards some future use of the data that I'm putting into my, that I'm typing into my phone. And I think that's a really important question about who's making the rules for this and who's governing that. And the answer right now is, nobody really. Another ethical issue with this type of research relates to transparency and fairness or bias. I think researchers have an obligation to describe their findings and to understand the outputs of their data models. But when I perform a logistic regression, I can very clearly articulate my thought process and my conceptual model behind that and what the output means. But AI is not transparent by design. And so we can be led to believe that we understand something, but we can't really understand what's going on. And the larger and more complex a model is, the harder it is to understand, even though its performance is generally better. That's the whole point of AI. And I think this is a problem because we are adopting technologies that we don't really understand. Like, on one hand, you can't understand the data, and that's probably bad. But on the other hand, how is this different from other technologies do we use? Like our ubiquitous use of computers, or we don't really understand how our car works, et cetera. Like, is that okay? Is that a problem? With AI, many of the algorithms are produced by private companies, and there isn't any regulation guiding the field, which contributes to like a real lack of transparency regarding how the models are produced. There are, best practices for validation, but these practices aren't regulated either, and they're likely to be really domain specific. And because many systems are these black boxes, the reasons why the decisions are made the way they are not easily accessed or understood by humans, and therefore they're difficult to go back and probe and ask questions. So what I mean by this, in other words, like with a traditional statistical analysis on the top box, right? We have control over what we're putting in the model and how we measure things and how we code things. And so we can tell the model to ignore or to not ignore certain features. So if we're helping build a model guide like hiring decisions, we might program the model to weigh certain characteristics like prior work experience more heavily than others, and then ignore, and also tell the program to ignore certain features like race. And this means that the results that we're seeing, we're very confident are not biased or influenced by these factors. But with a machine learning model, we're not programming the model in the same way. We're not supposed to know like how the machine's thinking all on its own. We're not supposed to know how it's doing that. And so we can't really determine how these factors are considered. And I just want to pause for a second and think about this notion of bias, because when people talk about, fairness and ethics and bias in machine learning, especially when you're coming from a technical background, it can be really confusing, what this term actually means. So for those of you that are statisticians, when you hear the word bias, you might think about the following things. So the idea first that the way that you're collecting the data might be biased in the sense that you're not collecting a sample that is representative of the population, like selection bias. You could also be talking about bias of an estimator, meaning like the predictions that you're making are kind of off the mark, that they're imprecise. But in the case of machine learning, I'm really talking about something that we would think of as inductive bias, which is the way we're trying to focus on a specific pattern of the data or what we're trying to learn that is not that is unjust or unfair. So the differences that are created from the model are in themselves biased in the sense that they're not fair. I think that the purpose of machine learning, is to differentiate, right? It's to determine who's at risk for something, which requires you to categorize into some sort. So thinking through bias today, I'm really referring to the unjust and unfair biases for differentiation. When we say that like some particular feature about a person, for example, their race or their gender, that isn't really relevant to the decision at hand is embedded into the model and highlighted in the model. And I think this is another interesting issue because there are circumstances when features like gender or your race might be predictive of certain outcomes, but we've decided, by society and by law that these things shouldn't be considered because, we've deemed them to be morally irrelevant, even if they are predictive. So in a traditional statistical way, you would not put those in the model, but AI doesn't know that. And so AI will. And one way we see the problems with how this plays out, the selection bias from, I mentioned that selection bias from a statistical sense might create, some sort of normative bias. And I think this is really well illustrated in how AI is used in criminal justice, specifically when arrest information is used to train models for predictive policing. So judges and courts have started to rely on machine learning to guide their sentencing decisions. Currently, courts and corrections departments around the US, they use algorithms to determine a defendant's risk, which ranges from the probability that the individual will commit another crime to, the likelihood that they'll appear for his or her court date. And then these algorithmic outputs are informed decision-making about bail, about sentencing, about parole. So the questions: who do you actually incarcerate? Who do you keep pending trial? How long? What do you set their bail at? And I think, again, there are a lot of benefits here in theory. So if a computer could accurately predict which defendants were more likely to commit a crime, the criminal justice system might be fairer. It might be more selective about who's incarcerated and for how long. But what I really want, what's really important to understand here is that arrest records, which are the data being used to make these models, they're not a perfect representation of the incidence of crime in society. Just like, medical record data are not a perfect representation of who's sick and who's healthy and who's not. I think police records, somebody else said, and I have this quote written down here, that police records are really, quote, a complex interaction between criminality, policing strategy, and community policing relations. So, those records are not really capturing crime as it occurs everywhere. It's capturing crime where the police happen to see it. So it's the type of crimes that people are likely to report given their relationship with the police. And if we build a model using these data, we won't necessarily build a model that predicts crime wherever it might occur. We are going to build a model that predicts crime where the police have been able to observe it in the past. And this contributes to this vicious cycle where you build a model and you suggest that you deploy police to a particular area and that those predictions are confirmed because you actually do observe crime there. But you've also directed your resources to a particular area that gives you less opportunity to view crime in other places. So you never get disconfirmatory evidence from your model, and the predictions keep getting confirmed over time because the model never has a chance to learn from other data. Does that make sense? This kind of vicious cycle, this is like a huge problem in AI, and it occurs, in all types of decision making where disadvantaged groups are typically judged by these algorithms more harshly than other groups, and that can have devastating effects for these populations over time. For example, this often leads to bias in healthcare delivery. So, these models, as I said, they often replicate the biases and blind spots of the humans who create them. So the algorithms are, built on these biased data or these homogeneous data sets that don't really reflect the patient population at large. If you think about hospital, when you're using big data to build a prediction, to research, to build a model for healthcare, the biases that are embedded in the healthcare data itself are going to be replicated in your model. So who, is the data coming from the IU health system really reflective of who is ill, or are they reflective, do they have embedded biases in them from other things? You could think that that's also true if data is primarily collected from like an academic medical institution. The AI systems that you'll produce are going to learn a lot less about communities that don't visit academic medical systems, and then they'll be less likely to treat those patients as effectively. And then I think this leads to a lot of racial bias in the system as well. So these algorithms, have been criticized for propagating race-based medicine. So the racial differences found in a lot of data sets, the disparities that we see between Black and white patients are most often effects of of racism or, the experience of being Black rather than being Black itself. Things like toxic stress, poverty, the physiological consequences from that. And so adjusting for race is not going to do anything to address those root causes of disparity. Instead, if the adjustments deter clinicians from offering clinical services to those specific patients, then they risk baking inequity into the system. And the machine learning model is not going to know that. We think that the computer is going to take away the biases, but they're really embedding the biases back into the system. So in this study, there was a clinical algorithm that many hospitals were using to decide which patients needed care. So this model was being used to predict intensive care for patients who had complex medical needs. So when this algorithm, this had been going on for a while, and then researchers decided to evaluate it, and they found that Black patients had to be deemed a lot sicker than white patients to be recommended for the same care by the algorithm. And this happened because the algorithm had been trained using patient data on prior healthcare spending, which reflects a history in which Black patients spend less on their healthcare, not because they have fewer, not because they have less need, but because they have fewer resources. And of course, the machine doesn't know this, so they returned a higher risk score for white patients because they said, oh, white patients are spending more money on healthcare, they must be sicker, leading more referrals to white patients for specialty services. And that perpetuated this, both, the spending discrepancies that we saw and the race bias in healthcare. Another set of ethical issues arises around privacy. So the requirement of large data sets creates incentives for developers to collect data from many patients. So some patients might be concerned that this collection might violate their privacy. Lawsuits have been filed based on data sharing between large health systems and AI developers. I think it's also interesting to think about how AI could implicate privacy in another way. When it predicts information about patients, even though the algorithm never received that information. So, this is kind of the goal of healthcare AI is prediction. So for instance, an AI system might be able to identify that a person has Parkinson's disease based on the trembling, their hand trembling over their computer mouse. So even if that person never revealed that information to anyone or didn't even realize it themselves, patients might consider this to be a violation of their privacy, especially if the AI interface through some data use agreement that information was available to a third party, such as to a bank or a life insurance company. Healthcare privacy regulations are in place for HIPAA, but they don't cover tech companies. So HIPAA only protects patient health data when it comes from organizations that provide the healthcare services. So
the screen has gone black. Is that just me, or are other people seeing that? Are you showing slides still? Something has happened.
I can see them.
Oh,
I can see them as well.
I can see them.
I'm going to be quiet now. Go on, Erika.
well, it's a screen that says AI and HIPAA, and then it has pictures of a smartphone, and it has this suicide algorithm, again, by Facebook. So Facebook created this in 2017. They rolled out this suicide detection algorithm in an effort, like a real laudable effort to promote suicide awareness and prevention. So the system uses AI to gather data from your posts and then to predict your mental state and your propensity to commit suicide. Use case for AI in healthcare, but benevolent intent aside, the fact remains that Facebook is gathering data and storing mental health data and doing it without your explicit consent. You consent when you sign the user use agreement in the past, whenever you signed up for Facebook 10 years ago, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're consenting for this specific use of your data. And nobody really knows what they're going to do with the data now, beyond their stated purpose, now that they have it. So in principle, you could imagine that Facebook gathers this data or step data from the app on your smartphone, your health data, or for my watch, my fitness tracker, and then they buy healthcare data from another company. They match the two. Then they have healthcare data that's matched to names, and they can start selling advertising based on that, or they could sell that data to others. And I think that just opens up a real scary sort of precedent. And then, anecdotally, I was at a conference and I was out to dinner with somebody who has 4 teenagers. And she was talking about this app on her phone, and now I can't remember what it was called, but it was something really creepy. And anyway, the app tracks, what her teenagers are texting, what they're Googling, and so that she knows, and then it'll send her alerts if the algorithm thinks that her kids are about ready to go out drinking, if they're thinking about having sex, if they've done something illegal. And then she gets these alerts on her phone. It's called Mama Bear or something. And, the thought is that that kind of use of big data to me is a little big brothery, a little creepy. Okay, safety and accountability is another ethical issue, the last ethical issue I think we're going to talk about. And the point here is that AI systems can sometimes be wrong, and that patient injury or other kind of problems can result from that. So you might remember this story. It's not a Facebook story, but you might remember the story in 2018 when there was a self-driving Uber who killed a pedestrian in Arizona. And this happened because the researchers who programmed this algorithm, they programmed it so that it only recognized pedestrians when they were crossing in a crosswalk, not when they were crossing in the middle of the street. Probably because they developed this in California where everybody abides by crosswalk laws. So, this seems like a real simple thing, right? One that's really easy to predict. Sometimes people cross in the middle of the street, but the program didn't have that information. And so it failed and somebody died. Healthcare has so many situations like this where human behavior is hard to predict, right? So did your patient take only half of the blood pressure medication because it makes them feel dizzy and then they felt bad, so they didn't tell you about it? Does the patient take herbal supplements and then just kind of forgot to mention them? Do they secretly smoke, but they might not want their partner to find out? Is their mom in the room so they don't want to tell you that they're having sex? So all of these sort of complexities make it even more likely that the machines are going to make mistakes. So if an AI system recommends the wrong drug for a patient, or it fails to notice a tumor on a scan, or allocate a hospital bed or it allocates a hospital bed to one patient over another who eventually dies, who's responsible when AI makes these mistakes? Is it you who made the algorithm? Is it the clinician who is implementing the algorithm? Is it the machine itself? And I think that what's real important here is that the responsible party is still unclear. We don't know. There's no resolution to that question. And then finally, monitoring and intervening during data collection. As a researcher, you have an ethical obligation to monitor the emergence of adverse events and to potentially intervene to mitigate negative outcomes. So how is this feasible in the world of big data? What's the trade-off here between participant safety and privacy? And how does this affect data validity? These are all really important questions that people don't yet have the answers to. Okay, so in the last couple minutes, I said I would talk about ChatGPT. which is hot news right now. And I was telling Peter before I started talking that I like started to do a deep dive on ChatGPT, and then I had to really pull myself out of it because I started to get real panicked about the future. But basically, ChatGPT is an AI program that people use for generating dialogue. So it's a chat bot with a language-based like neural processing model that it is able to, you know, you're able to fine tune it for conversational manners. So the main feature is that it generates responses like a human would provide, like in a text box. So like people could, you think that people could use it for like a virtual assistant or something. Like it doesn't come across as a machine. It really comes across as somebody that you're actually chatting with. People think for research purposes, you know, you can use it to write code. You can use it for research dissemination, to write articles, for translating, for writing stories. And this has gotten so much buzz over the past couple of weeks that people have said stuff like ChatGPT is one of those rare moments in technology where you see a glimmer of how everything is going to be going forward. I mean, that's intense, right? Like this is the future of how everything is going to be. I went on ChatGPT because I wanted to use it to write this presentation. I was like, oh, maybe I'll just, you know, kind of chat it up, but the system had crashed. So I will say that I'm not sure. I can't speak from experience, but I know Peter has a story about his experience with ChatGPT. I wasn't allowed to use it, but people are like all over. And it proposed correct options, including the correct one. So this was verified by a cardiologist who was surprised. So, you know, the thought that ChatGPT might be really good in clinical care application. And also for research dissemination. So can ChatGPT write your research papers for you? Is that okay? You know, how do you feel about that? I think that that's something that I do want us to spend, you know, we have almost 20 minutes to talk about all of these issues. About, you know, how you balance what researchers want versus sort of the ethical risks behind using this technology. These are not going away. It's part of research life now. And I think that it's important that we have these kinds of chats because I know it's like, as it evolves, it's hard to embed it into sort of the curriculum that we have. So I have, you know, ethical questions up here, but I don't know that we really need them because I think that there's a lot that we can just kind of chat about on our own. So I will stop talking and stop my screen share. Stop share. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for your patience. Oh, Peter, you're muted.
As usual. So I'm going to let you field your questions and conversations. So go at it, everybody. I assume we've got many thoughts.
Peter, I actually want to hear your ChatGPT story because I like said that I would talk about it and then it was only like 30 seconds of my presentation. So I kind of want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I'm happy to. So I just, my teenage son, my 10th grader showed it to me about a month ago. And basically he'd written into it the prompt he'd had for an English essay, which was like, discuss gender and power in this obscure short story they had read. And I thought, oh, it can't do that. I mean, Google's amazing, but it's not. It wrote a 4-paragraph, you know, solid B. I mean, a little repetitive, little like formulaic, but you know, I'm a teacher. It was a B. So I'm like, oh, that's a fluke. So I put in my favorite, which was, you know, could discuss physician-assisted suicide using a utilitarian framework. Classic thing I would do in one of my classes. Not bad. B-, C+, you know, passing grade for sure. A little repetitive, a little simplistic, but really very good. It's not that it's cutting and pasting, right? It's actually an AI, apparently. It's finding data and it's putting it together into a paragraph. As you said, Erika, you know, it looks like a person. And of course, this is what we've been expecting all this time. And I will say about all the things you raised and about this discussion, I feel like you show Minority Report, I always go to the Terminator, right? It's like the singularity that machines take consciousness and it's the end of the world. And in some ways, we can't talk about that. That's not a medical ethics topic. But in other ways, it's the topic here, which is when machines can think, what do we do? And the question you're asking here, which I'm sure people have a lot of thoughts about, is as we're doing research now, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger is still an old man in California, not a cyborg from the future. We can use AI in our research. We're involved in actually moving AI forward. How do we handle the ethics? I thought you did a great job with an enormous topic of showing some of the issues. And I'd be very interested, if you want to talk about ChatGPT, go ahead. You want to talk about the research stuff that Erika focused on, that's great too. So go ahead, everybody. And I see John's come on video, which usually means he's ready to talk, but maybe not.
No, also to listen. Thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. I'm completely unknowing about a lot of the AI stuff. It was interesting to hear about your talk about the ethical issues in the predictive use of AI. I remember it was decades ago. I was in Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Department of Juvenile Justice, whatever it was called, wanted to create a supermax for the juveniles that were locked up in order, they said, to capture the up to 5% that might try to commit suicide or hurt themselves during their incarceration. And at that time, using just computers, somebody I knew said that in order to capture that 5%, they would have had to put somewhere around 72% of the kids in that supermax. And so what's interesting is just to see the advancement of the predictive stuff in terms of the ability to see greater, more intense and more detailed dangers of the predictive model.
Yeah, I think that the prediction stuff. So in my own, I said that I'm using AI in my own stuff. So I'm using it for prediction as well. So I'm taking data from kids' birth certificates and their, the first 2 years of life, their well child visits, and then some information from their neighborhood, and using that in a machine learning model to predict their risk for obesity when they're older. Because like with obesity, it's one of those things that is really hard to shed the weight once you have it. But so the thought is move upstream and predict who's going to have the weight before the weight comes on, then perhaps we can intervene and move the needle a little bit. But it's really hard, because how do you communicate that risk score to a parent? Like, what do you say to a parent of a 6-month-old? They're going to ask, well, why? What is it about my child that is going to make them more at risk for obesity? And the answer will be, well, I don't know, something in the model that's happening behind the scenes that I don't know about, because it's thinking all by itself. And then this other question, well, it's going to show disproportionate views based on race. Is that okay? Like, it's not about a person's race that makes them have more likelihood for obesity. It's all these other things. And so there's, it's not a perfect. I think people think the machine's going to do it better. And I don't think that's true. I think that in our application of AI, it's more about like, how can we use that to augment what we know? Like, let's not let the machine think for us. Let's think with it, maybe. I see some other stuff here.
So you literally were just using birth certificate and what other data?
Well child visit, and then census geo data from their neighborhood.
Up to what age? Visits up to
24 months.
Wow. I mean, I'm just thinking of I'm a sociologist, so I think of all the more social aspects that contribute to obesity that would not be captured in that.
Correct. I see a hand raised. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, he's working.
Sorry about that. I'm doing it on an iPad, and it's a little slower to unmute or do these other things. You pointed out a lot of the issues in bias, and some of them are really unconscious. Some of them are hard to deal with. I'd make a quick prediction about what you just said, which is that zip code would do a reasonable job of predicting obesity. And the problem there is all sociological. The stores around there, what's available to you in shops, et cetera, differs greatly in minority communities, for example, or any underserved or under-resourced communities. And that's always a big problem. I've been involved actually, and I submitted some information to the FDA actually, because a company was wanting approval for its AI thing, which came out as a device for the FDA, by the way, to predict who is likely to become an opioid abuser or opioid addicted if you treat their pain with opioids. And a few of us saw this and were at a much earlier stage. There was this person who has a company published this a few years earlier, and it was based on totally garbage science. You threw in a bunch of these things that they thought were genes that were relevant, and they threw it in with a badly chosen population, and they come out with this machine learning answer. we did an exhaustive test on this using 5 different types of machine learning language because they wouldn't reveal what their black box was, with all sorts of things. And what we found is it predicts race very well. And that's all it predicts. It had zero predictive power about opioid user versus not. And yet this was going in front of the FDA for approval. So obviously a number of us are still trying to stop that. So there's conscious bias. There's just badly designed experiments. This is a real tangle to deal with. And one quick comment on a totally different issue in terms of the Facebook using your data.
Yeah.
You pose it as if their experiment was their only experiment on you. But in fact, their baseline algorithm is a huge experiment on you also, and probably not much different in ethical, I don't know, in the general ethics of their general baseline model, even before they tweak it.
When I started my faculty appointment, there was an associate professor, or she had just, I don't know, she was another professor in my division, and she left right after I started because she got a job at Facebook. And she was a social behavioral PhD, real strong research, analytic skills. And I just remember thinking, like, why in the world would she go work at Facebook? That doesn't make any sense at all. And now of course it all clicks to me because I just didn't realize the extent. I'm not a social media person, so I didn't realize the extent to which they were doing it. And I think your predictive, your garbage in, garbage out raises a lot of really, really critical ethical issues about machine learning in this space, because a lot of times, there isn't any regulation over the development of these models. As academics, we are in, the work that I'm doing, we have these highly curated academic data sets. We are able to sit down and really think through things and to really, make the data sort of pretty before we put it into the model. But other, third-party institutions that are not regulated at all, that are being hired to do these things, we have no idea, who's validating those models, if they're being validated, what's going on. And then I think when you deliver the results and you're like, oh, this is machine learning, it's AI, it's a computer, everybody, gets kind of caught up in like the sexiness of it all and sort of doesn't ask these questions because they don't know that they should. Christopher, sorry, I see your hand raised also.
Oh no, thanks for taking the time. So I'm Chris Newman. I'm with the radiology at Riley Hospital, and so I think one ethical issue I would like to think through in terms of these issues is the ability of AI to allow these new predictive models that will often expedite our ability to or expedite the gap between our ability to predict risks, but also intervene on those risks. And so I'll give you an example. I think the history of medicine is replete with examples where we were able to predict risk, and then we started doing interventions without actually having evidence for a lot of those interventions and those outcomes. And so even one example from the COVID pandemic is, Paxlovid was approved for non-vaccinated patients, yet we readily use it in vaccinated patients, even though the only randomized control trial being conducted at this point is the Panoramic study in UK, and we're still awaiting those results. And so this is an example where we look at patients who are vaccinated, who have risk factors. Now we're intervening using something that actually hasn't really been well tested. And so there's a lag between the ability to predict risk factors and the ability to actually put interventions that make a real difference and that have evidence-based outcomes attached to those. And so do you worry that our ability to make these risk factor predictions will exacerbate that problem now in terms of basically having a longer delay of actually testing many of these interventions and their outcomes, even though we know a lot more about the risk factors?
Does anybody have any thoughts about that? I don't know that I do off the gate. I have to really think about that.
I like it as a comment. I know we may have some other hands, but I like it as a comment, Chris, because predicting risk, as we know in the risk prediction field and stratifying risk, is only valuable if you've got an intervention which helps, right? And doesn't hurt. And so all these things are really important to say, well, oh, great, we can figure out who's at high risk for suicide, or, oh, great, we figure out who's at high risk for obesity. That will be great and valuable if there's an intervention which actually helps. In addition to these other issues being raised by, what if you had a great risk stratification model that actually relied on race? Is that, and also with the AI, as I'm going to add, Erika, what you've said, the black box, we don't even know if it's using race, although it sounds like Howard and his colleagues were looking at that and figured out that it actually was basically just using race. It's basically all race.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, like, unfortunately in our society, race usually is powerful for differentiation of risk, right? And like, but that is not, that is about so much more than, so I will say, yes, all the AI models are likely using race to predict risk. Is that the right thing to do? I mean, we've decided as a society that it's morally irrelevant, but does that mean that it's not like clinically relevant? Question of life.
Presentations now, we don't say the race of the patient at the top. We used to say it at the beginning, so, African-American, 40-year-old female. We don't top anymore.
Well, because I think that your interaction with the patient shouldn't matter, right? But if you're looking at a risk score for who should be in intensive care, is that important?
Especially if you save a life, especially if looking at race. Okay, well, we're at the end of the
quickly to the point you made about that, though, you get the vicious cycle of all the socioeconomic things that cause the differences in what we call race, and that's a bad word also, but self-described race is probably the clearer one, and these models build it in again. So some of these things may predict better, but they're predicting better not based on things not based on the reality of what's happening to the person. They're based on a societal discrimination.
Right. And then you asked about the regulatory institutions. I think that the Facebook professors, I think they're from UCLA. I think they got their hands slapped, but they didn't technically do anything wrong. Well, I really appreciate everybody's. Well, I mean, there's another second, but I appreciate everybody's attention. This was a lot. This is always a lot of fun.
Yeah, great. And of course, it's a continuing conversation. We always say at the end of these talks that if you are doing research involving AI, you want to talk to somebody, come talk to the bioethics program of CTSI. We call ourselves BSAP. And Erika, we will, I'm sure, help you in all of her copious free time. We always help you think things through, because doing this research and helping medicine become better is, of course, our goal. But then, as Professor Cheng has shown us, it's just a tremendously complex area, raising issues as it maybe can help us address. So again, thanks everybody, and thanks especially Erika for doing this. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.